welcome to Xcede's Sofa Series podcast, Sid. It's our first data one, so thank you very much for being the first person to attend. Sid, we've known for the best part of 10 years, worked closely with him in most of his roles, placing him in 3 different positions at Adform, Inmarsat and Builder.ai, with Builder.ai especially a special one for us as we help build out the whole data department from scratch. Thank you for attending today. It's going to be a really interesting conversation, I hope.
Thank you, Luke. Pleasure being here.
It'd be great to understand a bit more about your experience in more detail. I know it's a brief overview into how you end up in the data market from when we initially spoke 10 years ago.
Xcede and I go a very long way back. As you explained, I think you've helped me. In fact, I remember the very early days of Matt and Niall, who work for you, who helped me actually get some of my early roles. And it's been a really sort of journey of partnership together, I would imagine, over the last 10 years. You've also helped me build my teams at various organizations I've worked at. Now that I kind of reflect on it, it has been an incredible 10 years. I feel I've condensed 20 into 10. It definitely feels that way. And part of the reason is the pace at which the profession has actually evolved in the last 10 years. When I started my career, data science as a field was very nascent. Most companies at that time they didn't have a data scientist. There were very, very few companies. I think it was very tech-led who had started to hire their initial data science scientists and build out data science teams. I mean, if you went to a FTSE 100 in London and asked if they had a data scientist, it was very unlikely. They even had a data scientist. A lot of the roles back in the day were data analysts, which now as a profession has kind of evolved into data science. So yes, it has been an immense journey. I've had good successes along the way, several points of where, I've had to kind of step back and reflect on how I could do things better. But overall, I just feel like a much more richer person professionally, having had those experiences.
And why, obviously, going back probably even before we initially engaged with one another, what made you choose data? Obviously, with your educational background, I'm sure you had quite a few options when exploring the commercial market. What was it about data that you thought, this is what I'm going to go with?
That's a very good question. I think, there are many of us in the profession who've kind of arrived at data science or engineering from different angles. And partly because it's I guess the profession really kicked off about 10 years ago. In terms of my own journey, one thing that, I guess there are certain personal attributes about me which I think lend themselves quite well to data and data science more generally. I've always been a very curious person, and I've always had very good observational capabilities. So I can observe things, understand them deeply, and find ways to improve them. So these skills came in very handy when I was sort of investigating data. I also realized that, and this happened particularly during my PhD, one of the things that I really kind of enjoy doing is to understand how things work empirically by gathering data. So my PhD was focused on, trying to detect anomalies in images using kind of machine learning, but pre-deep learning. That was really the focus of my PhD. And I did a lot of work with sort of other scientists. So I work with physicists, I work with statisticians, and other sort of scientists who really taught me the value of, data-led hypothesis making, which came in very handy when I started to make my initial inroads into data science. I guess I had a natural knack anyway, but my PhD really honed my skills. Subsequently, when I first started out in industry, I actually started out, as a management consultant with Ernst Young, I joined the initial consultancy program that's aimed at graduates, and I worked my way up. And even during those experiences, what I felt was consultancy as a profession at that time could have been far more data led, but it hadn't reached that stage of evolution yet back in the day where they had the tools or the technology to become or to sort of operate in a very data-driven way. Those days, consultancy was very hypothesis-driven. There was a lot of human judgment involved on the part of a consultant. And I felt that I could see a progression path for consultancy. It was just that I was very early, I think, and it didn't happen at that time.
Yeah.
So I then decided to move on to a different path. I ended up doing another postdoc, went back to university, did solid research in applied ML for 3 years. And some of the research that I did actually ended up becoming commercialized as a data product, which is very interesting. And that gave me my first kind of exposure to how you can build great digital products and experiences using data and algorithms. So I guess, I kind of fell into the profession to some extent. I guess I had attributes which lend themselves very well to this profession, but it wasn't, I guess, a conscious choice, I would say, if I were to look back.
Okay. No, that all sounds really good. Thank you. And I suppose looking at that tenure from back, 10 years ago to where we are now, and you mentioned about the changes as well with, I suppose, where consultancies were there, and I think where consultancies are now, and that's probably highlighted that a lot of them will go McKinsey or buy a Quantum Black, for example, to get that specialist specialist skill set within the business. What other changes have you seen over that time? And you've obviously worked for a variety of different companies, in different industries, mainly high growth. I think that's obviously has been a fairly common trend. What other changes have you seen in that time that have been really sort of pivotal in that data journey?
I think, one of the sort of very significant shifts that I've seen over the years is, when I started off, right, very early days, companies would almost struggle to understand what data could, or what value they could get out of investing in a data science or in a data team. That was always the question at hand is, okay, here are some interesting ideas. Yes, we understand this is what you can do with our data, but what's the actual value? How is it going to impact our bottom line? How is it going to improve our customer experiences? How is it going to improve the digital journey? How is it going to improve our operational efficiency? I think all those questions over the years have now become answered to the extent that I think a company that doesn't have a data team today is not going to kind of thrive for much longer. I think a data team and a function has become an indispensable part of a company's growth and financial journey. So I think that business case question, which I used to often get confronted with in my early days, those have been taken out of the equation. Sure. So companies are no longer asking how can data add value to my company anymore. I think where we are right now is actually what companies are trying to understand is what further use cases can lend themselves to an analytical question. So I think we've shifted the paradigm over the years. And that has been an exceptionally kind of positive development, I think, in industry. So this is one trend that I've certainly seen. I guess moving forward, we've kind of now reached a stage of evolution where companies are now starting to think about Gen AI and the impacts of Gen AI, which is a very kind of far leap from where they were 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, definitely. That, I suppose, leads on to another question of the last few years within data, and Xcede have been in the market for nearly over 20 years, myself nearly 16 years. The last couple of years have definitely, I'd say, been chaotic at best. I think we had a couple of years where it was unbelievably active, loads of recruitment, big massive teams were being built, in multiple industries, most industries, I think, regardless of where that company was in its journey to growth. And last year, I think everything it did slow down. We didn't quite see the investment in growth in data as much as we had seen in prior years. And I think there were a lot of questions being asked of, okay, is there still the value being, what value is it providing? Is it providing enough value? I think that's probably a lot to do with the economy and what's been going on in the world with various obviously situations. Where do you see, you mentioned AI, where do you see the data market? How do you see companies now focusing on how to get the most out of a highly performing or high performing team, highly efficient team? Where do you see the company's investment going, and how these potential various different data verticals were being built?
I think, we have to take stock of what happened around 2019, 2020. Just before COVID and when COVID hit, there was a period where I think a lot of companies over-invested in data. They ended up hiring, and this is not just in data, actually, this is far more broader in tech. There's been a lot of talk about how many companies, including the likes of, the big FANG ones, actually ended up over-hiring a lot of data and engineering professionals at that point in time. I think what we're seeing more recently is almost a level of consolidation in the industry, where companies have started to realize, okay, perhaps we did overhire at that stage. How do we now make the best use of all the resources that we put in at that point in time? So I think there's definitely this is sort of like a wide challenge for the industry. In the US, for instance, more recently we've seen a spate of layoffs across the tech sector. It's happening today as we speak. And I think part of that is a consequence of that consolidation and almost kind of trying to eke out efficiency savings, which companies hadn't really thought of when they were overhiring. So I think more generally, I guess, the more recent trend, especially over 2023, is companies have reduced hiring. Part of it is fueled by the fact that a lot of startups and scale-ups in general haven't received the level of funding that they would have pre-pandemic. And so they've had to become much more leaner in terms of how they structure their teams, what they build and how they end up building using their existing teams. One trend that I see more recently is, if you think of kind of, what technology was 20 years ago, there were a lot of, I guess, offshore companies that sprung up to support engineering and IT, initiatives across the world. I see a similar trend that's happening in data now, where a lot of sort of small, I guess, you can call them as, data body shops that are springing up in different parts of the world. So more recently, for instance, I engaged with one such sort of data services company based out of Cyprus, who are essentially kind of supplying talent to other startups and scale-ups. I think this trend will continue. I think we'll see more kind of data type service companies springing up across the board. There'll be sort of a greater proliferation of consultancy and professional services in the data space as well. I think a lot of traditional companies, as we've talked about, have started to invest in their in sort of springing and bolstering their data and analytics teams. But we'll see sort of smaller players come to the fore as well. So these are wider industry trends. And so I think over time, what's likely to happen is data teams and data and analytic teams more generally wouldn't grow to the same size as they did in some of the companies as we've seen before. So I take the example of like a delivery startup I worked for a couple of years ago, who, at one point in time grew to having a data team of about 200 people. I think that's very unlikely to happen in the future. I think startups and scale-ups are going to be much more leaner. They're going to need fewer but more specialized skill sets in data analytics. So an example would be, they would have to make the distinction between, so imagine you're trying to kind of hire a data engineer. The hiring manager in a data and analytics function will have to make a decision on what type of a data engineer do they actually need. Do they need an analytics engineer who's going to be essentially building data transformations for BI? Are they going to need a data engineer who's going to build a streaming data platform or sort of optimize a data warehouse? Or are they going to need a ML ops engineer who's going to help data scientists productionize ML models or LLMs in production, for instance? So these are sort of some of the considerations hiring managers will need to make. And I suspect they'll have to become far more careful about what skill sets they actually hire.
Sure. And do you see the potential impact or influence of Gen AI being a potential big deciding factor in how the market evolves within engineering science?
If I'm completely honest, and this is my opinion, I think currently there's a lot of hype around Gen AI. I mean, if you really kind of put it into perspective, Gen AI, as a technology that's kind of available to the masses is about 2 years old, right? So I truly think it's in its infancy. In the Gen AI world, there's essentially going to be like a clear bifurcation between companies who focus on purely developing the Gen AI technology, so the likes of OpenAI or Anthropic or Element.ai, for instance, or there'll be consumers of that technology, which will be the wider world.
Yeah.
Now, in the wider world, I think it's still very early days. I don't think companies have fully thought out all of the use cases that lend themselves very well to a Gen AI deployment. We have to remember that Gen AI as a technology is still quite expensive. It's compute heavy. You need the right infrastructure to make that happen. So companies have to think carefully about financial budgets, for engineering teams who are likely to deploy or use this technology. So it's a lot easier to implement a very simple machine learning model in production than it is to actually deploy and run and maintain an LLM model. So I think there will be maturation of these technologies over time. And I think companies will still need to figure out what are the actual use cases that are really sort of applicable for Gen AI. If they are going to replace human beings, with automation in some cases, what are those specific areas where they're going to invest in and make that happen? And I think we're still very early days yet. I'm hoping that some of the hype that's in this area will die down over 2024 and beyond. But with technology, there's always that new shiny thing. OpenAI might come up with GPT-5 tomorrow and it might change the world, right? Yeah. So it remains to be seen. But I like to take a more, if I were a CDO making decisions today, I'd take a much more cautious approach.
Yeah.
I'd like to at least identify those 3 or 4 problems that can truly leverage the power of Gen AI to its fullest. So rather than trying to sort of shoehorn a technology into a problem, let's find the problem first. Let's define the right question, and then use Gen AI as a tool would be my approach.
Sounds good. No, definitely. Obviously, there was a lot of hype out there, a lot of hype. And you mentioned about, obviously, if you're a CGO and you were a CGO at Simply Business, that was quite a fast trajectory from, obviously finishing, your PhD, your fellowship to entering the commercial world. The CDO, I suppose, is out there, that C-suite is definitely one where it probably raises a lot of questions of where it sits. Should it sit at the boards? Should it potentially sit under a CTO or CIO or CPO? I mean, with regards to your experience and, like I say, that very quick trajectory to get there, what were your thoughts around a CDO and when that should sit in an organisation? Because everything you've said there around obviously the I suppose the changes over the last few years within data has been quite, like I say, stop-start with regards to a lot of activity, sort of the consolidation, restructuring teams, maybe in smaller, agile, maybe more specialised in certain areas. We don't got Gen AI. We've come through quite a challenging 3 or nearly 4 years actually with regards to COVID, obviously other situations, wars in the world with, obviously the cost of living, inflation, all these different factors that come into play that have caused many challenges. I think there will be more questions being asked of data as well. And for me, that would be a more important role within the organisation. What are your thoughts? Do you think that a data person should be sitting at that top table? Do you think that's how the market potentially will continue to evolve, or do you think that data might just be essentially spread out across a CIO, CTO, CPO? Where do you see the market going there for someone who's obviously sat at that level?
I guess, part of a lot of these decisions is influenced by the fact that data is a profession, again, and analytics. Well, I guess data and analytics as a profession is rather immature, if you put that into perspective. Companies have had technology teams for 30, 40, 50 years. They've had product teams for a good 20 to 30 years, right? Very few of them have had data teams beyond the last 10 years. And so the data and analytics as a profession, I think, is quite immature. And therefore the thinking, around some of the questions you've asked is relatively immature. And I don't think there is necessarily a right answer. I think, one of the things I have noticed through my kind of own experiences is young companies tend to have done better in this regard and figuring out the right structure than some of the older ones. And part of the reason is because they've actually built, young companies have evolved from scratch, right? So they might have brought in a VP of data and analytics or a VP of AI at the right time to be set up in the right possible way. I think some of the bigger companies, so companies in the FTSE or in Nasdaq, so some of the most listed bigger enterprises have really struggled. One of their initial struggles was, I guess, where does data engineering sit? Does it sit within the CTO organization? Does it sit within IT, which is not a very uncommon scenario or used to be in the past? And I think that's a terrible idea, by the way. Or does data engineering get brought into the data organization, right? So that's been like a common, I guess, theme that I've seen throughout my career. The other, I guess, problem that companies often have to face when they want to scale or build a data and analytics function is how does that function actually get structured, right? What's the operating model for a data and analytics function? Is it a centralized function where resources are fully centralized and then they essentially act as a service provider to different business units? Or a model that I've often espoused is where the data teams actually partner effectively with other teams. A good example for this is, the work that I've been doing more recently, where I essentially have dedicated product data scientists who are embedded within product functions. They work very closely with the product manager, with back-end engineers and designers to actually shape and measure success of various product features. That's a model that's worked quite well in the product setting. Does that model also work for growth and marketing teams? Can that work for operational functions where you might need a operations data scientist? I think these are, there's no right or a wrong answer. And I think companies are still trying to figure that out, right? I would say that, where data scientists have to work very closely and hand in hand with business stakeholders and business units, an embedded model often works very well. And part of the reason is because businesses feel empowered because the priorities for what the data and analyst professional do, what they end up doing, actually comes from the business. So they co-create problems and co-defined questions, which actually ends up instilling a lot of trust, between the two teams. So I think there'll be more kind of embedded data teams in the future. I truly see this model sort of scale out even further. And so again, going back to one of your original questions, I guess the thinking around how data and analytics teams should be structured, whilst there is no definite answer, has also matured over the last 10 years.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. I think, company from company, I think the data engineering element factor question will always be around. I think, where does it sit? We get that on a daily basis. I think when speaking with clients and how best is it embedded, product cross-functional team. Like I said, I think it just depends where that company is, how the company's structured in general, for you to how best to apply a certain type of structure when it comes to data. With regards to, I suppose, anyone looking to get into the data market, as you said, it's changed a lot over the last 10 years, especially over the last few years. What would be your sort of recommendation to anyone who is at university, completing a PhD or a master's, whatever it may be, but potentially looking to get involved within data? What would be your, I suppose, recommendations, advice to someone who is looking to enter potentially the data science, engineering, analytics market?
I guess, if I have to put myself in their shoes, there's probably two things that, two questions that I would ask myself. One of them is, what kind of a data professional do you want to be? Do you want to be, a core practitioner or a research practitioner or an applied practitioner, right? This is a very clear distinction in industry. Sort of research data scientists or research machine learning scientists, for instance, their core focus is on actually kind of research where they're furthering knowledge around specific areas like LLMs or probabilistic machine learning or what have you, right? Their kind of incentives are very different to what an applied data scientist or an applied machine learning engineer would do, who essentially build systems or help towards contribute towards building real world systems. And their incentives are to make sure that other teams succeed, right? So if you're applied product data scientist working with product teams, your goals are to ensure that the product team succeed. So I guess the incentives between research roles and applied roles are very different. And I think it's important that you understand that distinction and try and sort of almost map on, have some kind of a plan on where you might fit in, right? And it's important to make that distinction early. Otherwise, you might end up in a wrong role and be, very unhappy for quite a while. And I think, today, you can start to make that distinction quite early. When I was training as a student, I couldn't because, the field was very nascent and immature, and these kind of distinctions didn't arise very much. The other thing that I would do if I were a student today is to try and solve as many kind of problems or create hobby projects that I can. One thing that I did during my PhD was I was always kind of, sort of thinking about various applied problems. And I am an applied data scientist or an applied scientist. I don't see myself as a researcher in any way. And that was because, I was always trying to solve some problem, right? I was very interested in problems. I would always end up picking an algorithm or a technique to solve a problem. But for me, the thing that really motivated me was to solve a problem. And I think, if you are kind of made that way, then use your educational experience to try and solve as many problems as you can. Sometimes in areas you might not even have thought of, right? There's a lot of interesting data that comes out in fields that that you're not directly in. So, for instance, if you're studying mathematics or computer science, right? Find out what your colleagues in bioinformatics or in chemistry are doing, because all these different professions now are generating lots of interesting data, which lend themselves very well to analytical techniques. And so actually, having a wider understanding of different data generation mechanisms in other professions can go a long way. And so if you have the opportunity, yes, explore further, find out what other questions are out there in other professions, because you might start to see connections.
And would you recommend the types of businesses? Obviously, you started off EY, back obviously to studies, and then obviously entered the commercial industry market after that. Would you say that any particular types of organisations or industries are potentially a better fit for someone who is starting out on their journey, or do you think again that comes down to the actual person themselves?
One of the good things that's happened over the years is you're allowed to make mistakes early on in your career, and I have made some myself, right? So it's okay to you don't have to make the most optimal decision when you start off your career. I think it's important to have some sense of conviction on what you want to do. But it's, you might find that at some point you realize that you want to try something else, and that's okay too. So I don't like to be too prescriptive. I think eventually, if you follow your passion and, start really kind of chasing what you're really good at, you'll end up in the right thing. And I think it's okay to make mistakes at the start of your career, and I wouldn't call them mistakes. I think they're actually opportunities that you explored, but you realize that it wasn't for you, and you've pivoted. So it's in the long run of things, I don't think it's going to do any harm. If anything, you've learned something along the way.
Yep, no, definitely, it's all a learning curve. And do you think there are certain sort of geographical locations where you will see that there's going to be a potential high demand or high growth than others? You've also mentioned the States with a lot of layoffs still happening. It looks like the UK potentially has come to the end, but I've said that a few times over the last few months, and then some more spring up. Europe seems to potentially slow down a bit. Do you see that, yes, any of these areas or any other areas globally that we're going to see some high growth or high investment in the data market?
I think time will tell. We're living through some quite uncertain times at the moment. I think if you think about the macroeconomic climate, it's very uncertain. With everything that's going on in the US and the Middle East and, all of the conflicts, it's really hard to tell, how stable the global economy is likely to be in the next few years. But if I see where the potential is, I think, so for instance, a lot of the governments in the Middle East are actually putting in a lot of investment around digitization today. There's some very, very large kind of digital projects that are being run in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and some of the other countries. So I see potential opportunities springing up there. I think, interestingly, they're also trying to these governments are also trying to incentivize people from the West to actually go and work there. For me, that's still an unexplored question, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out over time. But I do see, significant amounts of growth in that part of the world. So if recently, for instance, last year, one of the top LLM models, open source LLM models actually came out of a lab in the UAE, which was unheard of, back in the day. So they're really trying to catch up to, if not, sort of supersede what's happening in the West. You always have to sort of look at China and keep China at the back of your mind. The growth in China in AI and data science in general has been immense. And I think that will continue. China is a huge market. India is an interesting one. I think one of the challenges that the Indian economy faces is often it's buffeted by global politics. And so it remains to be seen. So there was a period, again, pre-pandemic and during COVID, where there were quite a few successful startups that sprouted in 1 year, and they became unicorns, and they hired lots of data professionals. But again, there's been a rationalization of in this startup space in 2023, and they've actually ended up laying off a lot of people. So I think, in general, if we kind of assess everything that's going on, things are quite uncertain. I personally wouldn't put my finger on, I don't think I can put a finger on the pulse just yet. However, I do see a lot of potential for growth, particularly in the Middle East. And we shall see how that pans out.
So Sid, it'd be great to understand your journey to becoming a CDO, as definitely if you look across the industry, it's very varied how people end up becoming a CDO. It's a question I get, again, probably on a daily basis, of people wanting to become a CDO. How do I do that? What sort of decisions should I be making now to give me the best opportunity to become a CDO? You achieved it in a relatively short time, in the marketplace. It'd be really useful for our listeners to understand, your experience, the types of experiences you gained to give you that opportunity to become a CDO at Simply Business.
There's a couple of, elements to success. If you want to get into a leadership role, there are certain things you have to do well. And you asked me the question in the context of a CDO, but I think sort of my answer would be more generic. I think one of the things that sort of you have to be able to demonstrate throughout your career is your ability to actually build and manage teams and people effectively, right? A CDO effectively is a managerial position. Now, when I started off my career, I had no kind of formal, education in management necessarily. I'd come out of a scientific degree. I was pretty fresh. I had to sort of mold myself through the years, pick up new skills, and learnings that guided me along the journey. And a lot of those learnings was around how do I build teams, how do I manage people effectively, and how do I take care of the people under me, right? That was a very big part of my own development. And I think my learnings at that time were mainly kind of influenced by great managers I'd worked for. So one thing I would say to anybody who has aspirations of being a CDO or rise to the C-suite is look out for what other good managers do. What are they doing well, right? How do they build and manage teams? Maybe sort of get a mentor who might not even have to be in the data profession, who can help you and guide your journey through that process. So I think that's really important. I guess you have to have some natural inclinations in some specific areas. So one of them is communication. I think good leaders need to be able to communicate clearly and effectively. And part of it is because if you think about what a CDO or any leader does, they're essentially guiding teams and other people towards success. And it's not just individual success, it's the company's success. And so a CDO has to be able to convey vision into reality and chart out the path. How do you make that happen? And to be able to do that, you have to be able to motivate and guide teams effectively throughout that process. Because what highly technical or individual, smart individual contributors, what they're really looking for is, can you help define the problem effectively as a leader? And I think this is something that I was able to do quite successfully through my many stints. Is because I was always naturally interested in problems. I could understand the business problems well. I was able to communicate with stakeholders effectively to really understand their requirements and needs, and then play back to the team. And to be honest, if I were to I was never like, if you had a competition for, who was the best data scientist at that time when I was a data scientist, I probably wouldn't have been, the best of the lot, so to speak. But what I was really good at was understanding the problem, translating that problem into a solution, and then delivering that to people's expectations. And I think this is what sort of helped me throughout my career, and more so on the problem definition part. Part of this that you have to understand is, as you sort of rise up through the ranks, you're exposed to more and more senior people. And the language they communicate in, the business jargon they use, is quite far away from what's used in the data science world. So you have to be able to, so by being an effective communicator, you have to not only be able to understand the technical jargon that your teams are accustomed to. You have to translate that into a language that senior stakeholders understand. Yeah. And I think I was able to do that quite effectively. And finally, you have to be interested in understanding how businesses work. Ultimately, if you're a data scientist working in industry, right, you have to be able to understand the domain, the intricacies of the domain, and the data generating processes in that domain effectively. And they, whilst there are similarities between various domains, there are also differences. So your ability or aptitude towards actually understanding and really distilling how the core ideas on how a domain works is really important. So if I look at my own career, I was able to flip between different industries. And I did that because I spent quite a lot of time initially in every role understanding how does that business truly work. And it's very important, you do that as a, not just as a data professional, but also, more holistically. Even as an engineer, I would encourage you to espouse these principles.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, you raised a lot of points there. I think you keep saying about identifying the problem, that inquisitive nature, wanting to solve that problem and utilising different techniques. I think the being more commercially aware, again, I think it's great if you identify that problem, but if you do obviously solve that problem or have an idea potentially that would solve that problem, what is the commercial impact? The one bit would be good to understand, and I think is your last point around delivery. I think that is in some ways I'd say the biggest challenge, but where a scientist or an engineer potentially making that step up seniority wise is having that ability to be able to speak to a variety of stakeholders, not just a head of data science or a CDO, but maybe a CPO or a head of marketing, whoever it may be, and having that ability to be able to make sure that they influence and deliver a compelling story so people buy into that depending on their technical background with regards to data. Was that something that just came naturally to you, or was that from watching other people that you respected at a senior level? How do you think you evolved from a scientist up to head of, director, CDO? How did you get that component, the actual delivery of strategy piece that really influenced and had an impact on the business?
I think, if you think about strategy and delivery more generally, I think, often at the heart of it, it's being able to tell a story. And I think if I look, at my own self, 30, 40 years ago, even at school, I was really interested in storytelling. I was always kind of, the other aspect to this is public speaking. I was always kind of exposed to public speaking from a very early age. And those are things that have kind of carried with me throughout my career. Storytelling is about, how do you kind of communicate in a way somebody else understands, and that's going to move people fundamentally, right? In almost an emotional or in a very deep way. And I think that takes a lot of practice, and I don't think it's something that you can acquire easily, right? It takes years of practice. So if someone's interested in that, I would encourage them to put themselves in position where they're out there in front of people telling a story. So part of success is about actually finding opportunities that align well with your skill sets, And I tried to do that along the way. I wanted to be in meetings and rooms where they were senior people, and I wanted to be able to tell my story, right? I knew I could do a good job, but I also had to find those opportunities where I could put myself in a room.
No, perfect for that. Thank you. And I suppose the next question, which, again, I get a lot, and I think it's probably one you may have asked yourself, is where do you see the progression opportunity for a CDO? Where would a CDO who is a CDO, do they just simply say CDO for the rest of their career, or is there another next step or steps that they would progress into?
That's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure. I think the jury is out on that one. But we can draw kind of, some inspiration from what's happening in other kind of, functions, as an example. So one thing that we're seeing in the product and technology space now is this sort of role of a chief product and technology officer, right? Yeah. This is a role that's kind of come into the fore, I would say, in the last 5 to 6 years, where a lot of young and growing companies have created a CPTO role, which is essentially where somebody who's either been a chief technology officer or a chief product officer could potentially fulfill. Perhaps, one opportunity for CDOs in the future would be to actually evolve into a CPTO role, especially if they've spent a lot of their career building data products, right? By building data products, you get experience in some aspects of product management. You definitely have the engineering you build that engineering know-how as well on how to build products that operate in production. You learn about A/B testing and experimentation and so on. So one potential progression path for a CDO could be into that sort of CPTO role, which especially in companies where that leverage or use data and analytics heavily, right? I can see that as an opportunity. I guess the other kind of path that could pan out is if you're a CDO or an analytics professional who's devoted their entire life into, I guess, building data-driven marketing strategies or growth strategies, there is an opportunity for you to potentially evolve into a chief marketing or a growth officer once you gain that domain, enough of that domain experience over time. I don't think there is on this one, I don't think there is a definitive answer. I think we'll find that, people kind of pursue their natural passions to some extent. And, if you're good or if you're a great CDO, an opportunity will be created for you within the company, depending on where you've really added value. If you've added huge value in building and scaling significant data teams, then you might have the opportunity to actually become the CTO or the CPTO even. So it remains to be seen, I think. I think one of the things that isn't, I guess, this is a bit of a stumbling block for a lot of CDOs or VPs of data today, is what's the next step. I think the jury is out on that one. Yeah. I do see potential opportunities and paths, but whether people are willing to take that is another question.
No, I appreciate that. And as we are, I suppose, close to wrapping up, and I really appreciate everything you've disclosed of us and discussed, and raised a lot of points. And I think there's a load of information there for anyone who's in the data market or looking to get in the data market at various levels, or maybe not even the data market, who could take a lot from this. Is there any sort of final points you want to maybe add to our listeners?
I guess the only point I would like to add is there's never been a better time to get into data or data science, engineering, or BI as a profession. I would really encourage young students to, if they're interested in data, in analyzing data, in managing data, to start to really get their hands down and dirty on solving actual problems. And by the time they graduate, they'll be in a much better place. There's also a lot of tools and technology now readily available for them to really start to learn the art before their first job. And the sooner you get started, the better. But there's never been a better time.
Thanks a lot, Sid. It's been an absolute pleasure today. You've raised some unbelievably interesting points. I think it's going to give plenty for our listeners to think about regarding whether you're a student looking to get into the data market through to a seasoned professional or someone who obviously works very closely with data and how potentially to obviously work to a higher level. We will be seeing you again when you'll be chairing our next CDO roundtable event. So look forward to seeing you then and raising, I'm sure, some more interesting points.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's been a pleasure being here, and I look forward to the event. Thank you.
No, been our pleasure. Thank you. Cheers, Sid.